I played Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity for the first time in May 2020. I came away from the story so impressed that, as I usually do with games that I enjoy the story of, I tried to look up other people's analysis of the story online to see other perspectives, but I found nothing. I went all the way to the third page of both Google for written form and YouTube for video form content, and found nothing but some Reddit posts, a few surface level publication reviews from launch, and a few, and I do mean few, retrospectives that also didn't dive too deep into the story. So, as a result, I felt compelled to be the change I wanted to see and make this video myself. Before we go any further, a couple of disclaimers. First, it's important to remember that art is not objective, and my takeaways from the game are a reflection of my personal experience. I do not claim to be the authority on the story of this game. However, for the sake of video flow, I will avoid saying, in my opinion, 500 times and just leave it as an implication. Second, this one should be obvious, but just in case, spoiler warning ahead for not only PMD Gates to Infinity, but also Red and Blue Rescue Team, Explorers of Time Darkness Sky, and Super Mystery Dungeon. If you haven't played one of these games, please do if you enjoy the series at all. I think that all four games offer their own unique experience and deserve to be enjoyed on a blind playthrough. Okay, let's dig in. The main narrative appeal of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon for me has always been the aspect of melding the childlike wonder and interesting lore base of Pokemon with writing that addresses the nature of relationships. Rescue Team is about the ups and downs of codependency, Explorers is about how companionship lends itself to bravery, and Super is a little harder to identify for me, but I lean towards collectivism being the main theme of that game. Gates to Infinity is interesting in that not only does it dig into each of these other main themes to various degrees, but more so than all the other titles, Gates puts a spotlight on the less desirable outcomes of human encounters and the psychological effects stemming from those outcomes. Distrust, lowered self-esteem, isolation, antagonism, indifference, and above all else, what I think the game is pretty clearly critiquing, nihilism. While writing this script, I realized that I couldn't go any further without mentioning that this topic of nihilism is very important to me, since I realize that's probably a large reason why this story in particular spoke out to me so much. Many games that I love a lot, I do because they spoke out to me at just the right time and left me with an important lesson in mind. Earthbound taught me that it was okay and even cool to be weird. Metal Gear Solid 2 taught me that personal identity is a fragile construct and that's okay. PMD Red and Blue Rescue Team taught me about coping with loss and appreciating friendship. Now, a couple months after beating Gates to Infinity, I find myself consciously trying to be more hopeful and phase out negativity in my life. And look, it's 2020. There's plenty of reason for one to be generally losing their optimism. But for me, and I suspect basically everyone watching this video that is old enough to have lived a little, this was not my first depressive episode. Not even close. And at least for me, breaking out of a depressive episode always involved relying on some kind of coping mechanism. Some would stick for longer than others, but somewhere along the way when I was in college, my internal journey led me to lean heavily towards nihilistic thought. It's very appealing to a college student, as the uncertainties of one's social future, academic future, professional future, short-term survival for those of us without aid, the need to develop tangible skills for self-sustainment, and God forbid you're like me and you're a little bit too plugged into the internet, and then you can throw in fear of missing out, the state of the world at large, and any number of sensationalist topics with the rise of impression-based compensation fueling the internet. This can all feel like a lot at once. And what nihilism does is numb the uncertainty. Nothing matters, so why worry about anything? Being able to rationalize yourself into not worrying so much when that worry has overcome you for so long can feel quite freeing. But this line of thought does come at a cost. It also numbs the joys of life. You stop yourself from feeling complete, unfiltered happiness when your philosophy creeps in and deems it irrational. For example, why do you care that your favorite sports team won? That you saw something genuinely beautiful while going for a walk? That you met up with an old friend? Because none of it really matters. Once I realized this was the case for me, that I was numbing everything and determining that nothing mattered, I came to the conclusion that I needed to once again self-reflect and refine my internal philosophy. But obviously it's not just as easy as that, and it's a gradual process. So while I'm in the process of this journey, and I still am, but while I'm in the middle of this process, May 2020, here comes Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity, which is heavily relevant to this exact topic. I just want to stress that further before we dig in. Gates to Infinity opens in the same way as the other PMD games, with you, the player, determining your Pokemon avatar, and then you, the main character, going through the transformation from human to Pokemon and entering the Pokemon world in which the game takes place. I think it's worth pointing out that while Explorers and Super Mystery Dungeon use the reasonable assumption that the protagonist is a self-insert as a tool in order to set up a twist later on, that twist being that they are in fact already established characters, I do think that committing to the self-insert protagonist fully is in itself a very powerful tool in PMD, a series that has always tried to get at you emotionally by immersing you in this very personal dynamic with your partner. Gates in particular, of course, takes this aspect of the storytelling further in a couple of ways. Probably the most obvious being the multiple fourth wall breaks throughout the story, but also the focus on a larger party. And let me explain this. While your other party members getting more screen time does slightly dilute the dynamic between you and your partner being, well, just the two of you partners, it does help you gain a personal connection with Post Town, which is very important for this story in particular. Dunsparce and Emolga, especially, are really just two random people from Post Town. They hang out at Swana's Inn like everyone else. They know most people there, and they go through similar struggles as illustrated in the rest of town, as I'll further elaborate later on. And despite how fleshed out the two of them are, I found it easy to imagine the other townspeople being as likable as them, despite the flaws of those townspeople, if I were to get to know them. When the main evil driving force is something that doesn't really affect you as much as it does the society you are a part of, like in Gates to Infinity, expanding that personal connection is a strong way to get me emotionally invested in what happens to that society. And it definitely did in my case. So, to delve further into that, I want to talk about the chain reaction of negativity between the Bitter Cold and Post Town as I see it. Because I know there's some things that I personally didn't pick up on until my second playthrough. And once again, I acknowledge that I'm most likely missing some things as well. So, when you first visit Post Town, you see Roggenrola and Ducklet getting really aggressive with each other. And you get the feeling that something's a little off about these people compared to how your partner and Quagsire, which are the only two characters you've met up until this point, have interacted with you. But you're not quite sure what it is. Obviously, they are a little more combative, more aggressive, like I said, but it just tonally seems very off with how the game has presented itself up until this point. Quagsire explains that people have been on edge recently, and there's a correlation with an increase in mystery dungeons. Of course, we later learn that the mystery dungeons are really just a symptom of the bitter cold. So skipping a lot further into the game, Kiram elaborates more on this and says that the bitter cold creates the winds of despair, which is a surge of negative energy that is sent outward from the bitter cold and eventually reaches the town. As an aside, while the game mentions that the whole rest of the world is also undergoing these struggles and it's not just Post Town, for the sake of consistency, I will refer to both Post Town and the world at large as the town. At your first trip to the Great Glacier, you see firsthand that near the epicenter of the winds of despair, which is the bitter cold, your party collapses almost instantly as their bodies give out. Hydragon explains this by saying that the bitter cold is actually powered by negative emotions, and the winds of despair overwhelm a Pokemon's spirit with negativity. Thus, it stands to reason that should the bitter cold grow too strong, everyone else is subject to a similar fate as your party members near its strong point. We also know that the bitter cold is not mind controlling. There is a line in which, on your first trip, Umbreon is frustrated at getting so close to the Great Crystal and not being able to see it before collapsing. As much as Umbreon's consciousness definitely wanted to move forward, his body would not cooperate, as the negativity instead put him and everyone else into a momentary deep depression that was relieved by Kiram. So, if I may be allowed to cite Wikipedia, they define depression as, quote, a state of low mood and aversion to activity. It can affect a person's thoughts, behavior, motivation, feelings, and sense of well-being, unquote. Anyone who has been through a depressive episode can relate to those days when the last thing you want to do is get out of bed, and you just sleep in and nap and otherwise lay around, not because you're physically tired, but because you just have no motivation to do anything. You don't feel good about it, and oftentimes a part of your brain is screaming at you to accomplish XYZ thing that you really should do or even want to do today, and it would most likely make you feel better, but you just can't. More often than not, this inactivity leaves you feeling physically poor as well, since your body needs to be active. A decent amount of people on the internet, at least from my experience, still don't understand that depression is physically caused by tangible disruption in your brain. It's not just one's conscious mentality. So now, imagine this disruption, but tuned up to the scale of a final boss of an RPG, and you have the bitter cold. It's quite the formidable foe. But the thing that I find most interesting about the bitter cold as an evil force is that there is a chicken and egg relationship between negativity coming in and going out. It's never really made clear if the bitter cold itself is what started Post Town's spiral into negativity, or if it only sped up a process that the town was going to eventually undergo anyway. The characters themselves don't even come to a consensus on this. Kiram thinks it's the town's fault, and Quagsire thinks the town and world at large was fine until the bitter cold intervened. Now, of course, there are multiple characters outside of just Kiram and Quagsire who share these stances, but for the sake of consistency, I'm just going to refer to these two sides as the Kiram theory and the Quagsire theory. Just keep that in mind because that will be coming up later. But regardless of who's right, Post Town undoubtedly has had its own chicken and egg type of compounding negativity between the individuals in that town. We see multiple examples of this, many of which are in your party, but I'll try to save those until later when I get into the party member breakdown. Probably the most obvious case outside the party is Girder. I really love how the Girder segment is so early in Gates to Infinity, because you are thrown into the situation of an average townsperson in the Bitter Cold era pretty much immediately. You need Girder's help because otherwise you're sleeping at Paradise in the desert with no shelter. So you go into Swanna's Inn to meet Girder. He responds to your request for a house building job with this awkward pause before he gives you instructions. And then once you leave, the Timber come out and they're about to say something to you, but then they decide against it. It's just weird vibes from the get-go. You, the player, know something's going on, but maybe not exactly what it is or how it will happen. But there's a little bit of doubt creeping inside you, the player. Then Scraggy shows up, steals all your stuff. Girder laughs at you and tells you to go back to the last dungeon and do it all over again. And if you're anything like me, at this point you're thinking, forget that. I want a piece of Scraggy. This dude just stole my stuff. But then the Timber come out for seemingly no reason and tell you to chase after Scraggy and reveal that he stole your gems. And all of a sudden, I don't even want to go anymore. That's so suspicious. I don't trust Scraggy, I don't trust Girder, I don't trust the Timber, none of them. But the story continues. Scraggy and Girder meet up for basically a drug deal that you listen in on. Girder says he thinks you and your partner are morons, and then you come out and fight them. After that fight, Timber and Timber both show up, say that Girder hasn't been acting like himself, and then beg Girder to return to honest work again. Girder responds to this by knocking them out on the spot, which for me is still one of the more memorable parts of this game. It just completely shifted my expectations of this story because, in my opinion, this simply would not have happened in any other PMD game. It just would not fit tonally. And this is the exact moment I went, this guy is truly not right in the head. He's not just selfish or just a jerk. He's deranged if he's physically harming these Timber, presumably longtime co-workers that have had a friendly relationship with him, with no remorse at all. And of course, the Timber just get right back up, and instead of getting mad, beg the player and partner to just let them have their boss back, and proceed to describe how Girder became so jaded when a customer blatantly disrespected his work that he put so much pure passion into, and it broke him so bad he lost all confidence and spiraled into who he is now. In the span of one cutscene, I went from I hate everyone involved and want to kill them all to I genuinely feel really bad for both the Timber and Girder. Not so much Scraggy yet, but whatever. 2 out of 3, right? It's such an important precedent to set early in this game, and gets you in the mindset of giving everyone in town the benefit of the doubt that maybe they have a reason for their actions. Everyone has a story. It's easier to be empathetic to those you don't know when you're thinking through that lens. And like I said before, that's particularly important for this kind of story. Then you fight Girder a second time, and he explains his current philosophy. Quote, "This world we live in, it's all about who's doing the lying and who's being lied to. Honest folks just look like fools. In a world like this, you're the ones who get blamed for being tricked. So you can't get mad at me, it's just the way this rotten world works." Unquote. Of course, this isn't really correct, and it's just Girder hyperfixating on his bad experience and applying it to every situation. But that is a real thing that people do all the time. And the longer it continues to eat at them, the further down this rabbit hole they go. So what Girder was saying made complete sense to me. It's at this moment that I really started to think about how I was ready to just make quick work of at least Scraggy and Girder, because they clearly did me wrong just a little bit earlier. But if the partner wasn't there to take the optimistic route, the faithful route, I would have really been no better than Girder, right? Someone does me wrong, I lash out and start becoming distrustful. Now let's make it clear that Gates to Infinity is not even close to the first video game to do this, but it was still executed very well in a rather mature way, despite the limitations of needing to use simple language in a kid's game. So the game has now established this idea of someone was bad to me, so I'm losing faith, that is repeated many times with many characters in this game. But there's another aspect of Post Town that I feel needs to be addressed, and that's the Rainbows of Hope. The first time the Rainbows of Hope are mentioned is when you first meet Virizion. She says that she came to Post Town to see the rainbows, then Herdier lets her know that they've been gone for a long time. Basically since the mystery dungeons started popping up, aka when the bitter cold gained enough influence. During this conversation, Rufflet says something interesting regarding the Rainbows of Hope. Quote, "You'd feel like you could give it your all again after seeing them. Having that kind of hope for tomorrow is why we could give it our all every day." Unquote. This quote implies that for many of the Post Town residents, they didn't ever really feel hope unless they recently saw the Rainbows of Hope. Give it your all again is the terminology used. Later on in the game, you talk to Swanna, who laments on the decaying relationships and attitudes within the town, and then Herdier again interrupts by saying, quote, "Crivens, and all because of the Rainbows of Hope do not appear these days. Oh, I'll be the first to admit that I and all the good folk here in Post Town, well, we've been finding it might hard to hold on to the hope since the Rainbows left us." Unquote. Sorry if I butcher that, by the way. They have that written in, I don't know what that's supposed to be. Is that supposed to be Scottish? Whatever. It's they do not write it in I guess the same language as the rest, or the same vernacular. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. But regardless, that's his quote, right? So why does he say this? He goes on to explain that he thinks the rainbows disappearing is a bad omen. And it definitely is unnatural, but why would that be enough to almost immediately make Post Town spin into negativity? My takeaway was that most of the town actually doesn't have a solid mental base for internally fostering hope, and they never did. They were just using the Rainbows of Hope as a short-term coping mechanism, much like how someone in real life might start drinking heavily or taking drugs when they feel down. It's obviously not a perfect comparison, but both can serve as temporary but powerful escapes from whatever's going on in your head. But once you take the outside help away, all you're left with is your own mentality. And that's where most of Post Town is at during this game. Without the coping mechanism in place, much of the town eventually slid into varying degrees of nihilism. This is natural since, remember, nihilism numbs negative emotions. To go back to the Girder example, he adopts hyper-selfish thought under the pretense that being nice is meaningless, and everyone else tries to use others for their own gain. This has roots in the assumption that the obvious benefit of being nice, which is building relationships, isn't actually quote-unquote real, but it's just a social construct, it's just psychological manipulation, or it's just your brain chemicals working, or any number of other things. Point being, Girder eventually adopted this assumption for whatever reason, in response to him continually stewing over that customer being very not nice to him. And his way to stop that was to eliminate the concepts of kindness and meanness and deem them meaningless. To deem something meaningless demonstrates an extreme lack of faith in that thing. This means that Girder must have concluded that his own kindness in the past clearly didn't mean and never meant anything either. And this is where nihilism's suppression of positive emotions comes in as well. In the case of Girder, an example would be how the two Timber were genuinely pleading to go back to honest work, and that they really enjoyed being around Girder before, but the kind emotions, I guess, just did not even register to Girder. It did not get through to him. And of course, with a force like the bitter cold in the mix, a reduction in pain from negativity doesn't matter when that negativity is still there. Like Girder, even though maybe he's suppressing the pain from trusting someone and having them stab them in the back or whatever, he doesn't really feel pain from that, but he is still exuding negativity, right? And the player even feels this. They feel angry at Girder for being a jerk. There's still like net negativity coming from Girder while under the effects of nihilism. And worse off, positivity has a much harder chance to enter the fray to counteract, because again, it's being numbed. So you almost certainly have just this net negativity coming from someone. And with that in mind, it's no wonder that the town had the chain reaction of negativity compound so quickly. By the end of the game, the town is completely irrational, outright ignoring your partner's plea to stay positive, as if they're just trying to find a way to spin it into only receiving the bad information. And this climaxes when Roggenrola reaches peak enlightened nihilism and says, quote, "If the world's just gonna end anyway, shouldn't we just do whatever we want?" Unquote. And then Scraggy follows with, quote, "If we're all doomed anyway, we might as well just have a good time." Unquote. The world itself is no longer real. Like, the world is just a construct at this point. The fate of the world doesn't matter. This is how far they have sunk by the end of the game. And it's quite scary, honestly. This cutscene hit a little bit too close to home on first playthrough. I'm going to be completely honest. And I was quite disturbed. But, of course, not everyone in the game was subject to this fate. There's Swana, some of the Paradise members, and most notably your party, which obviously is going to be what the game focuses on most. And what your party has in common is that they too have their own ways of coping with the negative world around them. It's just that their coping mechanisms are internal instead of external, and thus have a little more life to them than the rest of town. The exception being Veriziad, who at the start of the game just doesn't cope at all. It is a disaster. But for everyone else, that's pretty much the case. But of course, this doesn't mean that these other methods don't have their own negative effects. Again, this is one of those things where I know I definitely related to some of the particular coping mechanisms used by the party members, which helped me personally connect to the game, and I don't think I'm alone in that assessment. Like I said before, PMD has always been a series that focuses on relationships, and Gates to Infinity is no different. Gates demonstrates how positive relationships allow us to grow as people, and in this case, literally overcome the world around us by shifting our mentality to truly think positively.